The first major challenge to the US policy of containment, which really, when you also tie in NATO, is more of a Western foreign policy at this point, is the Korean War, which was fought from 1950 to 1953. So, as our background here, Korea used to be a Japanese colony. This history actually goes all the way back to the US age of imperialism and the Root Takahira Agreement, which, if you recall, was when we agreed with Japan that if they would play nice in China and agree to the terms of open door policy, we'd not stand in their way if they wanted to colonize Korea, and so they did. But then in the aftermath of World War II, Japan isn't really in the position to have colonies anymore, obviously, and so Korea is divided along essentially the middle at the 38th parallel so they can hold elections. But when that happens, the northern part of Korea becomes a communist state, which makes a whole lot of sense actually when you consider that they're bordering on now communist China. Communist North Korea then invades non-communist South Korea. This is where NATO and the United Nations and all of the Western nations, including the United States, come in. This war happens in essentially 4 steps, as you can see here from our panels. Now, this is going to seem very tidy and organized, but keep in mind that it 100% would not have been that way for the people who fought in this war. War is never tidy or organized. People make incredible sacrifices during war: physical, mental, spiritual, familial, monetary, and in all kinds of other ways that are impossible to quantify. So we never want to forget that in our efforts to place these things on a map or explain them with charts or numbers. There's always a larger and yet very personal context that these things need to fit into as well. But working with the tools that we have here, which is our set of maps, here's how we can break down the large-scale movements of what happened. First, we've got the movement of what at this point are communist North Korean troops into South Korea. They move all the way down to the very southern part of the peninsula to where the UN or United Nations forces are stationed already. In our second phase, UN forces then are able to drive the North Korean troops essentially all the way back to almost the northern border. So for now, this is actually looking really good. It's also worth pointing out here that these are technically UN troops, but the vast majority of them are American. This isn't to toot our own horn here, it's just the reality of the situation. Now, in the third phase or panel, you have a pretty dramatic change. This is where China enters the war at the end of 1950. This makes a whole mess of sense if you think about it, because understandably, one, if China is communist and North Korea is now communist, they're going to be inclined to help them. But two, North Korea is acting as essentially a buffer between non-communist South Korea and China now. So they're going to do whatever they can to keep that buffer intact so that the UN doesn't decide to come rolling into China and disrupt their communist government. This is also where the UN forces run into a bit of a problem, because when they weren't just fighting the North Koreans, this was a pretty evenly matched fight, or at least a moderately easy fight. But now that they're massively outnumbered, if we're talking about the UN forces against the entire Chinese army that can send troops from just across the border, while the UN would have to wait for reinforcements from all over the place. And so this becomes incredibly more costly and time-consuming and difficult. So in the end, what ends up happening is our fourth panel here. Nothing, essentially, at least from the start of this war. We end up at the 38th parallel again, essentially, with communist North Korea at the top and non-communist South Korea at the bottom. And it's here that we call it off and sign an armistice, which I want to emphasize isn't a treaty. It's just saying that we're going to stop shooting at each other. So they agree to create what's called a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, and leave each other alone. And that's the hotbed of tensions that has existed in Korea since essentially the 1950s. And since then, various American presidents have done things to try to either ease tensions with North Korea or provoke them into coming to the table, but these things have been largely unsuccessful. Most recently, we've all lived through Donald Trump's on and off attacks on North Korean leadership that had Americans worried half the time that missiles might be cued in our direction, but then led to a trip to North Korea for theoretical peace talks, which didn't quite pan out later. And to some degree, we can urge our executive leadership to continue toward this goal of reconciliation, but we should always remember that when we walk into talks with North Korea and other nations that we have long histories of hostility or mistrust with, Cuba also comes to mind, we should always do so not just with current global issues in mind, but historical perspective as well. At the time, probably the biggest scandal to come out of this entire war, which is really saying something actually, was the firing of Douglas MacArthur. When China entered the war at the end of 1950, MacArthur, one of the nation's most beloved war heroes from World War II and a national legend, wanted to drop an atomic bomb on them to end the war right then. As a military man, he was looking for the fastest way to end the war, and to him, that was it. But President Truman didn't want to use this option. In his mind, it was an excessive use of something that would kill untold millions of innocent people who had nothing to do with the fighting and who might not have anything to do with their government's communist tendencies. Pretty much senseless murder of poor farmers. And it might not even save that many American lives in the end because they'd still have to keep fighting for part of the war anyway. And so he rejected the idea. And MacArthur just thought that this was so stupid. To him, Truman, who hadn't served in the military, was making a bad decision that was bad for the men overseas. So he went to the press and told them exactly that, which was insanely stupid because Truman was his boss. Like, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed services. And he had given his final word on something. So to go whining to the press about it and to embarrass the chain of command was totally out of line. So Truman doesn't care that MacArthur is a national hero. Nobody is above respect for the chain of command. That's like military 101. So he fires him publicly. And when asked about it, he was brutally honest. He said, quote, "I fired MacArthur because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bee, although he was." The Korean War is sometimes referred to as the Forgotten War. Often this is because it's sandwiched between two major other wars in our history, World War II and the conflict in Vietnam. Coverage of the Korean War was also highly censored due to the heightened hysteria over communism during the age of McCarthyism, although censorship over wartime messaging certainly isn't new in U.S. history. When you look at most history textbooks in the United States, World War II can sometimes span an entire chapter, sometimes two. The conflict in Vietnam usually is the better part of a chapter, if not an entire chapter unto itself. The Korean War is lucky to receive more than a paragraph or two. This isn't due to a lack of significance for the people on the ground during that conflict, Koreans or UN forces. Depending on their age, some men who fought in Korea were also veterans of the Second World War or the war in Vietnam. In fact, the Korean War was incredibly important to foreign policy in the United States. The strategies used in this conflict helped set the stage for actively implementing containment in conflict and would be used again in Vietnam. The end of the Korean War also set up the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, which shaped foreign and domestic policy for most of the 1950s.